Ready to get started. Did you miss me? Yeah. Liars. No, I hope you had a good time. Were you gone, James? I hope you had fun with Chris last week.
It was good.
He's a great guy. He's my traveling companion teaching over in India. And he has my old job at my church. And I couldn't be happier because he's the man for the job. So I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you are ready to get back into Genesis. Because we are closing in on the halfway point of the book. And we're in Genesis 20. 3 weeks ago. Last week I was busy. 3 weeks ago, we looked at Genesis 19. And in Genesis 19, what did we read about? What happened in Genesis 19?
Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed.
Yeah, the destruction of the cities of the plain, Sodom and Gomorrah. And we saw the treatment, the way Abraham treated the visitors when they came to his tent versus the way the men of the city of Sodom treated them. We saw Lot and his lack of parenting skills, to put it nicely. And we ended up, the text ended with all the cities of the plain being destroyed except for this one little city named Zoar. And because that's where Lot and his daughters ended up fleeing to. And then eventually they left even there and lived out in a cave. And there was a really horrible incident that took place that the scripture tells us is the origin of two peoples who would later come to be Israel's enemies, the Ammonites and the Moabites. And so we ended sort of there, and with Abraham looking on from where he was and seeing the destruction of Sodom in the distance. Now, just a fun fact, 2 weeks ago I was actually at the place where Abram, the oaks of Mamre and the tomb, the cave of Machpelah and all this stuff, and I was looking in the direction towards Sodom, and you can't see because it's very mountainous, very hilly. And so the destruction for Abraham, instead of the end to look out over the destruction of Sodom, the smoke and the debris and everything would have had to have been huge because it's not like it's across the road. I mean, it's miles away and over mountains and stuff. So it was pretty expansive destruction that he witnessed. So now, in chapter 20 then, we're going to come back to, the text is going to bring us back to the focus on Abraham at this point and his wife Sarah. They're no longer Abram and Sarai. Their names have been changed because the promise God has made has been clarified in the last chapter. The promise that Sarah will have a son, and it will be through Abraham, and that will be the promised seed that's the continuing unfolding. If you haven't been with us in this study, or if you're new to Genesis, a promise began way back in Genesis 3 that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. And then God called Abram in Genesis 12 and made the promise more specific and said, through your seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And so the promise is carrying on, and throughout Genesis, this promise that God's going to do something through the promised seed of the woman, who is the seed of Abraham. The promise is always being put in jeopardy by human decisions and human actions. And we'll see that in this section right now in chapter 20. Chapter 20, verse 1 says, now Abraham moved on from there being where he was when the angels came and visited him. Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. This is down at the sort of the north end of what is today the Sinai Peninsula. So south of Gaza, if you ever watching the news and you see the Gaza Strip, south of that, above that triangle peninsula between Egypt and Israel. For a while he stayed in Gerar, and there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, she's my sister. Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. Now, if you followed along in Genesis, this sounds familiar. Because when he was in Egypt, when he left and went down to Egypt for a while, he did the same thing with Pharaoh a couple of years before. Why did he tell the Egyptians, and this time the people of Gerar, why did he say that Sarah was his sister?
She was beautiful.
In the Egyptian account, in the previous account, it's because she was just really good looking. And why did that matter? Why wouldn't he be proud of having a good looking wife? Yeah, because this is before there was a police force and a lot of laws in place and security. Yeah, is basically worried, hey, if I come into an area and a king or a ruler wants my wife, he can just have me killed. And that's something that would have happened in the ancient world many times. It happened as late as King David. If you remember David and Bathsheba, and how did Bathsheba's husband fare? So there's a real reason for him to be concerned about this. But here's the interesting part. This is when Sarah's about 90 years old. Right? Like, this isn't like, a Sports Illustrated model that he's walking around with. This is a woman in her 90s who's past the age of childbearing. So why is she that good looking? Possibly. Maybe she aged really well. And more likely, much more likely, is the fact that we don't always think about it, but Abraham is an incredibly powerful and wealthy person. He didn't have a son, but remember, he had 318 trained soldiers. He had a huge mass of servants and caravan and goods and livestock and everything. He is like this mobile little society, basically. And so if he were to come into the territory of a king, and that king wanted to make an alliance with him or wanted to solidify their bonds or any of that, it would be perfectly normal to marry into his family. Even, regardless of whether the king desired Sarah or not, it would happen in the ancient world. You'd marry for political purposes or for safety or for solidarity or all of these reasons. So regardless, this king, Abimelech, thought that Sarah was marrying Sarah, taking her for his wife, would be a good move. It would be for whatever reason, whether it was political, whether it was just because he was in love with her. The text doesn't say. It doesn't give any reason for it. The other account that happened earlier in Egypt, it was because Pharaoh thought that Sarah was beautiful and desirable. But in this case, it just says he took her. And so then we read in verse 3, "But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, 'You're as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She's a married woman.' Now Abimelech had not gone near her," in other words, hadn't approached her to sleep with her. "So he said, 'Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Did he not say to me, she's my sister? And didn't she also say, he's my brother? I've done this with clear conscience and with clean hands.' Then God said to him in the dream, 'Yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, and so I've kept you from sinning against me. That's why I did not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you don't return her, you may be sure that you and all of yours will die.'" This is a very stern warning that God gives to King Abimelech. A couple of points that are worth mentioning. Abimelech is not a name, it's a title. The Abimelech. You could say the Abimelech. It means my father the king, or my father is king, or something like that. But we're going to meet another Abimelech later, and then another Abimelech later. So it was a title rather than a name. The second thing is his response to, or his interaction with the Lord is interesting. Because throughout Scripture, you get glimpses of what's called the righteous Gentile, or the righteous pagan. And they're not a lot, but every now and then you'll come across someone in Scripture who somehow, and the text doesn't even go into detail, but somehow has a relationship with the God of Abraham. Like King Abimelech, in this encounter, there's no recording of him saying, "Who is this God that's talking to me? What's going on?" There's just a perceived some type of relationship. Later you'll see it in other people that pop in. Earlier we saw it in Melchizedek, and you'll see it later in other righteous pagans that sort of come into the picture and come out. And so you get the sense that, one, God's not only just dealing with or talking to Abraham at this point in Scripture. God's active outside of the family of the promise. Just because Abraham's the promised seed and the instrument through which God's going to reach the world doesn't mean that the whole earth is not the Lord's and all that's in it, because it is. So you see God has relationships with people even outside of the chosen group. And you also see that God actually cares about, this is a theme that was picked up in the last chapter, what was Abraham's concern when God first mentioned to him what he was going to do to the cities of Sodom? What did Abraham say?
You're going to save the righteous or kill everybody?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, he said, Abraham said, "Are you going to sweep away the guilty with the innocent with the guilty?" And so they had the little bargaining session where Abraham talked him down to basically, "I'll save the entire city if 10 righteous people can be found there." So in this chapter, again, you see this dynamic at work. This pagan king knows enough about the one true God to know that God doesn't punish the innocent for the sins of the guilty. And so he basically says to God, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, hey, she said that that's my brother. He said that's my sister. So there was no adultery in my mind. I was thinking, I'm going to marry this woman." And basically, I didn't act in a way to try to break up this marriage or try to break apart this union. And God, what is his response? He says, I know you did. That's why I kept you from going on with this sin. God spared, in his grace, God spared this king, this pagan king outside the covenant family, spared him from doing something that would have been sinful. And not just sinful as in the case of adultery, but sinful in the case of if Abimelech had taken Sarah as his wife, and we already know from last chapter that within a year she's going to become pregnant, what would that have done to the promise to Abraham? You know, what if she were to become pregnant, there would be a legitimate who is the father of this child? Is it Abraham or is it Abimelech? And that would have called the whole legitimacy of this promise into question. So there's more going on than just somebody sleeping with somebody's wife or somebody taking someone improperly without knowing all the facts. I mean, there's more at stake. It's a bigger issue. Once again, the promise of the seed, the promise of the blessing is put in jeopardy by human actions. And in this case, it's the actions of Abimelech. And in this case, he didn't even know that he was doing something that was putting all this in jeopardy. So God appears to him in a dream to keep him from doing it. Again, when the blessing is the promised seed is in danger, God has a way of showing up and making sure that his purposes get fulfilled in spite of human sinfulness or human impropriety or human imperfections or lack of knowledge. So God is seeing once again that his promise that was started way back in Genesis 3 and in Genesis 12 and in Genesis 15, he's seeing that it's going to carry on. And he's making sure that it won't be put in jeopardy. Other interesting fact to note is in verse 7 when it says, "Return the man's wife, for he is a prophet." If you want to circle or highlight that, this is the first time the word prophet is used in the entire Bible. This is the very first time we hear that someone is called a prophet. The Hebrew word for prophet is navi, and it means one who sees. It's a seer. A prophet in the ancient world was someone who was considered to be the divine mouthpiece, someone that could speak the words of the gods, who could communicate with the gods and could see things and then speak to them. So that's the role of the prophet, and Abraham is the first prophet that we ever meet in all of Scripture. So God says, Abraham's a prophet, he'll pray for you, and you will live. But if you don't return her, be sure that you and all of yours will die. The sin, the destruction of the covenant promise is great, and it's great enough to have effects throughout the entire community. There's a sense that sin, while God doesn't hold individuals guilty for the guilt of someone else's sin, you do see in Scripture that the sin of someone, especially someone in positions of leadership, does have ripple effects and ramifications throughout all that they oversee. So the sin of a family or of a leader or of a king or of a ruler can very much bring about disastrous consequences for his people. Does that mean that those people are all guilty of that sin? No. The salvation issue is completely different. But does it mean that those people can experience the disasters and the consequences of that sin? Absolutely. And we see this going all the way back to the first sin in the garden, when creation itself was brought under curse because of the disobedience and rebellion of Adam and Eve. We'll see it later. Even within Israel, this principle will hold true. Within Israel, when one of the Israelites will take and some goods that God says do not take, a guy named Achan, and God will bring the same punishment on Israel as a result that he would have brought on the pagan nations if they were to do such things. So it's something that we have to hold in tension, because we want an either or. We want to say God punishes people for other people's sins, And that explains things like generational curses or generational sin or all of this stuff that we hear. Or we say, no, God only punishes the guilty and the innocent are always exempt and they go free. But that's not the case either. When a wicked nation does something wicked, its people do suffer. So we have to differentiate between the guilt, the punitive guilt, and the consequential guilt, or the effects of decisions that are made. Does that make sense? That's something that it's not fully explained in this chapter, but you're going to see it throughout Scripture. And so you want to hold both of those things in tension. You want to hold this in tension with like Ezekiel, I think 18, when God says, I don't hold the innocent guilty for the sins of the wicked. You got to hold that in tension and keep them both and say, Scripture does teach both. How do we make sense of that? And one of the ways is by distinguishing consequential guilt versus punitive or judicial guilt.
That still happens all the time today with countries.
Oh yeah, if our leaders do something dumb, we're going to pay the price for it. Yeah, I mean that's just part of it. Yeah, same thing in families. If the head of a household is engaged in wantonly sinful and destructive behavior, their children are going to pay the physical or the emotional or the psychological consequences for it. And that's a very real thing. But does it mean that God is judging those children for the sins of their father? No. It means those children are experiencing the effects of that. So it's a fine line that you want to maintain the balance on. You don't want to fall into sort of the superstition of saying, well, when I move into a new house, I need to pray away the spirits that the previous family put in this house, or else I'll be cursed with it. That's when you're getting into superstition and away from biblical theology. What you want to do is say, in the sphere that I'm responsible for, am I walking with God, and am I transmitting, or am I being a conduit for God's blessing and God's provision to flow through? Or am I in some way wreaking destruction and havoc into other people's lives? And that's what we see. God's preventing that in this case with Abimelech. So, verse 8, chapter 20. Early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all his officials. And when he told them all that had happened, they were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said, "What have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you've brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You've done things to me that should not be done." And Abimelech asked Abram, "What was your reason for doing this?" In Hebrew, he says, "What did you see that you did this?" So it could be the case of him thinking maybe Abraham, being a seer, being a prophet, saw something and wanted to engage in this behavior to bring about Abimelech's downfall or something along that nature. The response of Abimelech is in stark contrast to the response in the previous chapter of the cities of the plain. When they were confronted and faced with judgment coming up, like Lot's sons-in-law, they just laughed it off. They were like, yeah, whatever. When Abimelech comes face to face with the judgment of God, his response is immediately, up in the morning, gather all the leaders, get everybody together. Hey guys, this is what happened. This is what's going on. We got to make this right. In other words, there's a righteous response to God's call for judgment. We'll see this again later in the Bible, in the book of Jonah, when he goes to the Assyrians, to Nineveh, and preaches to them. Same thing. We get the sense of this righteous response on the part of these supposedly evil pagans. And so it should be noted when it happens in Scripture. Abram's response, verse 11, Abraham replied, okay, you want to know why? Here's why. I said to myself, there's surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. That's his first thing. He says, I thought, hey, this is a godless, evil place. There's no fear of God, and they're going to kill me in order to take Sarah as his wife and then have all of my household goods and everything else as well. So right then we see Abraham acted this way out of fear and out of prejudice, out of false stereotyping. He assumed, for whatever reason, maybe it's because he'd seen the people of Sodom and the people of Gomorrah and the people of Zoar and all these other places, he just assumed that these pagans were going to be evil and godless. And it's ironic because it's all throughout this section we've seen that Abimelech has a very, very healthy fear of God. And it's the complete opposite of what Abraham thought it was going to be like. He falsely stereotyped these people because they were outside of the community and just assumed the worst. And that led him to his dishonesty. There's when you see somebody else as the other, as the enemy, or as the enemy of God, then it creates in you this fear or this defensiveness. And you end up, a lot of times, doing stuff that doesn't please God as a result. I mean, I saw this firsthand the past 2 weeks over in Israel and Palestine. And just the way Israelis see Palestinians, the way Palestinians see Israelis, and in general, the way they demonize one another in their press and their leaders. And it creates this sense of fear so that you're actually scared when you go through a checkpoint. If you're a Palestinian, you're scared that this evil soldier who's occupying your land is going to find a reason to arrest you or beat you or shoot you. Or if you're Israeli and you're going into Palestinian land, you're going to think these evil Arabs that want to drive you into the sea, they just are looking for a reason to throw rocks at you or to kill you or to kidnap you or whatever. It creates this dynamic of fear, and then it leads to all kinds of ungodly behavior. And so that's what we see right here, at least what Abraham's thoughts are, is I got to protect myself because these people are evil and they'll kill me. And it's totally not the case at all. But then he goes on to try to justify verse 12. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not my mother. And she became my wife. And it's true. Sarah is Abraham's half-sister. We meet the two of them once they're already married, when they're old age. And so we don't know how they got together or the specific workings of that relationship. But from where he was and where she was, and they were in the same family, related, and they ended up getting married. And so he's not technically lying, but he is being dishonest out of his fear, out of his own sense of fear. He's being halfway truthful. And most of us have probably experienced situations like that, where we're scared and we don't want to tell the full truth, so we don't lie, but we don't tell the whole truth, and sometimes that can get you in trouble. Verse 13, when God made me, he's telling about Abimelech, he says, and when God made me wander from my father's household, I said to her, this is how you can show your devotion to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he's my brother. So we find out that this is not just a one-time or a two-time thing. This was Abraham and Sarah's agreement. Way back in Genesis 12, when they set out, when he left the land at his father's household, his community, which is what that term father's household means. It means community. When he left his community, he told Sarah, hey, just to be safe, wherever we go, you're my sister. I'm your brother. Right? So this was his way of operation. 14, Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and male and female servants and gave them to Abraham, and he returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, my land is before you, live wherever you like. To Sarah he said, I'm giving your brother, and this probably could have been in quotes, or there's a hint that he might have been saying, yeah, your brother. I'm giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offense against you before all who are with you. You're completely vindicated. In other words, I want everyone to know that you've done nothing wrong, and that I've done nothing wrong, and I've not tried to steal any wealth from you or from your, quote, brother. Go. You have my blessing. I've never wanted to cheat anybody. I've never wanted you. You're seeing the character of this Abimelech come out, and it's a totally righteous character. It's surprisingly righteous for a pagan king. And we'll find out in the next chapter, this place, Gerar, is the land of the Philistines. Abimelech's a Philistine, and the people there. This is uncharacteristic behavior for what you would expect of Israel's enemies. But all throughout Scripture, you'll see that. You'll see these righteous exceptions to the norm, and these incidents that pop up that help counteract the natural tendency towards prejudice within Israel towards the outsiders. So he gives her 1,000 shekels, or the text really in Hebrew just says 1,000 silvers, or 1,000 pieces of silver. And that, we think in our mind maybe $1,000 or something like that, but this is more than an average worker would earn in their lifetime. More than, I think 10 shekels is a year's wage or something like that. It's something extremely low at this point. This is more than a life. This is in the millions of dollars in modern language, if not more. So he just completely blesses Abraham in everything he does. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his slave girls so they could have children again. For the Lord had closed up every womb in Abimelech's household because of Abraham's wife Sarah. So we now see the danger that Abimelech and his people were in. It wasn't that God was going to rain down fire like he did at Sodom and Gomorrah, but rather that they would come to an end because they couldn't have children. They couldn't bear children. If he had unwittingly taken the wife of the one bearing the promised seed of God, then the punishment or the consequences were then his people would not be able to bear children at all, period. So there's a sort of a theme going on there, or a somewhat related cause and effect at work. But regardless, after he prays, Abraham prays for him, and then Abimelech and all of his people are restored, brought back to normal. And now Abraham finds himself a sojourner in this land, but extremely blessed by the generosity of this supposedly godless heathen king, who in actuality, in this instance, Abraham was the one who's at fault. Abraham was the one in the wrong. And this is a pretty stark lesson for the people of God. Even if you are chosen of God, even if you are blessed by God, even if you are the promised people of God, which is Abraham and his family at this point in history, it still doesn't mean you're not wrong sometimes. It still doesn't mean you are incapable of being prejudiced, or incapable of making a wrong judgment, or incapable of putting your personal safety above acting righteously. So it's sort of an implicit warning to Abraham and to the Hebrew people as well, and to us today as people of the covenant, is just because we are okay with God doesn't mean that what we do is above fault or above reproach. So we have to be open and be ready to look out for the Abimelechs that we come across, the people who we don't think should have a right relationship with God for whatever reason, but it turns out that they actually do, and they're a model of behavior for us. So I like this little story. It's very interesting. It gives sort of some flavor to the faith of Abraham and of Sarah. Next chapter is going to be the next big moment in God's redemptive history. The long-awaited, like 25 years awaited son is going to finally be born, and the next leg of this journey is going to carry on for Abraham and Sarah. So that's all for this week. Next week we'll pick up there, and I also wanted to let you know, got 2 minutes. So April 10th, I'm going to set these flyers on the corner of this table here. April 10th, the trip that I just got back from Israel and Palestine, I'm going to be talking about it and having a friendly debate with my good friend Dr. Michael Brown on the issue, how should we as Christians look at the entire situation in the Middle East in light of things like end times teaching and Israel's chosenness and Palestinian Christians and anti-Semitism and all of that stuff. We're going to have a good, open discussion. You're all invited. It's completely free. It's just down at Gordon Conwell Seminary down near Carowinds, and there's only 200 or so spaces, so if you want to come, make sure you get there a little early. But I would love to see as many of you there as possible, because it's going to be a good time. It won't be broadcast live. We don't have the technology to do that, but after, it will be recorded and made available either on YouTube or Vimeo or somewhere.
What time is it?
But all the information's on there. I believe it's 7 or 7:30. Grab a flyer before you leave. Grab 2. Invite people, because it's going to be a really good.
And what's the
evening.
point of the discussion?
To talk about how Christians should even look at issues like Israel, Palestine, Middle East, end times, all of that kind of stuff, how it affects. And what I saw last 2 weeks is that the views of Christians have real life consequences of the people of the Middle East. They actually have life and death consequences to the people of the Middle East. So we may think of it as just a theological exercise, but for my friends in Israel and in Palestine, it's daily life and death. So please come and check that out. It's going to be a really, really interesting talk.